Good evening and welcome to the latest edition of Clinical Trials and Black Folk, a program dedicated to closing the healthcare disparities gap through the specific pathway of clinical trials. Well, we will have a variety of industry professionals and trial participants sharing their stories to educate, inform, and enlighten us about clinical trials. We plan to put a real face on clinical trials. For too long, they have been a mystery. Well, this program will make organizations and people conducting trials real. And most importantly, many of them look just like you and me. For example, tonight's guest is Dr. Tanya Small. She is a global medical affairs therapeutic area head of oncology and chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion R&D Council at GSK. She joined GSK in 2018 from Ispen Bioscience, where she was the VP head of global drug development for oncology and rare diseases. She previously served as senior medical director for clinical development and medical affairs at Novartis. She is a board certified pediatrician, and she is a pediatric hematology, oncology, and bone marrow transplant specialist with deep experience in clinical research and drug development. She has done research in oncology, hematology, gene therapy, and stem cell transplantation, receiving NIH grants for her translational research in gene therapy and regenerative medicine. Not only has Dr. Small successfully led the launch of programs of multiple oncology therapies, she has also led many patient-centered and diversity initiatives. She is passionate about revolutionizing the experience and outcomes for people with cancer and will continue driving innovative approaches to research and development until we get there. So that was a lot, Dr. Smalls. Welcome to tonight's program.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No, we are happy to have you here. Just really excited to get into it. So we're going to get to a little housekeeping before we start our interview. So if you're what we'd like for you to do, you're watching tonight's program, drop in the comment section. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd like to know where people are watching us from all over the country and all over the world. We've had people from all over the world watching, so we'd like to know where you're watching us from. Also, if you know somebody that needs this information, tag it, share it, tag a friend, share it. We'd like to get this information to as many people as possible. And finally, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please drop those also in the comment section, and we will get as many as we can asked in the short amount of time we have with Dr. Small. So now that the housekeeping is over, first question for you, Dr. Small, is what inspired you to go to medical school and start the fantastic career I just outlined for our audience?
Oh, wow. It's interesting. So when I was an undergrad, I was a pre-med major and I was a dance major. Yeah. And both of them, I think, satisfied different parts of me.
Right.
The dancing was the creative piece, being able to put together ideas and express it. And then obviously the pre-med piece was the scientist and me trying to figure things out. And then also seeing what patients go through. And so what I decided to do was, then obviously I took the medical route, but then as you see my career trajectory, I was able to then start going into drug development where I was able to create medicines for patients.
Right.
But yeah, it's the ability to understand, not just understand and investigate science, but is the ability to do something about it that drove me really to propel me to move into medicine.
Well, that's fantastic. We just learned you're a dancer. So that is fantastic. And I think it speaks to the reason why I asked that question is because it speaks to really when we see doctors, we see them as kind of, not being one of us. I'm using air quotes on that. And really just trying to share that that's a part of you that says, okay, you're a real person. You enjoy things that other people do. However, you have a career and you have a passion behind really being creative, and you're using medicine to be creative. I love that. I love that tie-in. That's fantastic. So let's get down to the brass tacks of things, and that is, uh, how significant do you think the lack of diversity is in clinical trials, and are there any statistics? Kind of, ooh, well, we just lost Dr. Small. Okay, so while we're getting Dr. Smalls back, um, I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of lack of clinical diversity, and then we'll bring Dr. Smalls back to give her opinion on it. The reality is this. Well, the first reality is that's what happens when you have you're streaming, and so sometimes things go awry. But the reality is this: African Americans represent 13% of the U.S. population, but we only comprise about 3 to 5% of the clinical trials. Well, why is that important? It's important because clinical trials is not just where new medications get developed, and that's a significant part of clinical trials, but they also determine how much of a dosage amount, what's a safe and healthy dosage amount, uh, when you should take medications, how often you should take medications. So there's a multiple things that get fleshed out through clinical trials. If we're not in there, if I would say in general people of color, but specifically Black folks, if we're not in those trials, what happens is those medicines and those dosage amounts and those when you take it, should you take it with food or not, what the side effects are, all of that data is going to be really skewed towards the predominant ethnic and gender that is participating in that clinical trial. And so ultimately, that trial and that medication or that treatment plan, that treatment that gets developed, may not be as effective for people of color because they don't have enough data from that clinical trial. Well, what does that mean for you? That means that when you go to the doctor, if you have an ailment or an illness, and the doctor prescribes a medication for you that has gone through and been approved through a clinical trial, if there weren't enough Black people in that trial, then you get that medication, you take it, and you say, "Oh, it didn't really work for me." Well, that can have an impact in multiple ways. One of those ways being that you take that medication, you go, "Oh, the doctor didn't really help me," right? And so that could be a significant impact on how your treatment plan goes. And we got Dr. Smalls back, and so I was just filibustering, just kind of going through some of the things that how the impact of clinical trials happens, but it's okay. It is fine. It has happened to me, and so thank you, Roz, for as Roz just said that this is such an important conversation. So the question I was asking to you is, how significant is the lack of diversity in clinical trials, and could you kind of give us some statistics to really get people to understand that lack of diversity and the impact it's having on trials?
Sure. So, um, when I get asked this question, it's funny that you asked about medicine and me going into medicine, because a lot of what I learned in medical school actually pushed me again in this direction. I remember sitting in the lecture hall, and you got the syllabus, and in the syllabus it said, um, risk factors for diabetes, a sub bullet, Black race. Then you see something called hypertension, risk factor, Black race. And from med school, I remember, like, how can a race be a risk factor? And nobody questioned it. And so now when you look at the real stats, even today, and that was over 20 years ago, people of African descent are diagnosed twice as much as their white counterparts when it comes to diabetes. When you
Right,
look at even heart attacks, African Americans are 30% more likely to die from a heart attack. When you look at
right,
stroke, again, middle aged women and men are 3 times more counterparts. And then as an oncologist, um, when you notice the stats where Black race um, has twice the mortality rate when it
mhm,
comes to multiple myeloma, when it comes to prostate cancer, when it comes to even certain types of breast cancer, when it comes to endometrial cancer, and the list goes on and on and on. So we are dying
right,
sometimes twice the rate of our white counterparts. And so, and then the question is why? And obviously, access, right, to medicines is a big thing. When you're talking about preventative medicine, are you getting screened and are you getting access to medicine? But the second piece is really important. And it's making sure that the right innovative medicines are developed for us as well. Do they
Right.
understand the differences in biology, and the difference in genetics that we are? I mean, and we're understanding genetics, and we're developing medicines to meet those, to match those genetics. Do we understand that enough? And so this is where clinical trials become really important. And
Right.
when you look at the stats, what do we make? About 13%. African Americans make about 13% of the population. Yet when you look at the stats in clinical research, we make up about 5%
Right.
of the patients in clinical trials. So how can we develop the right therapies for people of
Right.
African descent if we don't understand sometimes the nuances of the biology? So this is probably one of the most important reasons we need to be in clinical trials.
So yeah, you just said a lot right there because when we're talking about in terms of really how underlying bias can be created, right? Just without even and there's two types of bias for those that don't know. There's conscious bias where you're really being selective and you're saying, okay, I know I'm being biased, and then there's unconscious bias, right? And so both of those types of bias can be dangerous. And so when we create unconscious bias by just having a risk factor being Black patient, right?
Yeah.
Now we're creating unconscious bias in our healthcare professionals,
Yes.
and the impact that could have on the patient provider interaction. It could have an impact on patient adherence because they're not
Mhm.
getting the right medicines that's impacting them, that's really helping them. So that bias can permeate all sources of
Yes.
of that healthcare experience for Black patients. And so it's just really important to have people like you out there really recognizing it and saying, okay, wait a minute. And I like the fact that you said, oh, that doesn't sit well. That's just a risk factor. Being Black is a risk factor for diabetes or hypertension. It's like, this guy's just got to be more than that. Wow. So we just talked about a little bit, but it's so how significant would you suggest that you know lack of representation is having an impact on that you know disparities gap that we talk about so much here in the news?
So a lot of it, because if you're talking, do you say? I mean, I just want to make sure because you cut off. You said the representation have to
Yeah,
do with the,
how does the lack of how does the lack of representation
yeah,
have an impact on that healthcare disparities gap?
yeah. And so again, I gave you numbers in terms of just outcomes,
Right.
right? And so um, when you look at the outcomes, and if you even look at, if you look at a good example is, and again, as you know, I'm an oncologist. If you look at multiple myeloma,
Right.
um, multiple myeloma, for some reason, people of African descent make about 22% of those that have multiple myeloma. But again, twice as likely to die. And what's interesting is what we know is if they're treated early, if they get in the right therapies, they
Hmm.
actually have a higher survival rate. So we're
Right.
learning the nuances of the genetics. We're creating the right medicines for them. But again, they're still not getting access to the trials. They're not getting access to medicines. And so you're seeing mortality because of that. And if you think about even the way we're moving in terms of precision medicine, people hear that word a lot, precision
Hmm.
medicine. I'm trying to understand the genetics and I'm trying to create the right treatment to address that genetics. If we don't understand what that is as we're developing drugs, we're not going to develop the right drugs for the patients that actually have the disease. And so
Right.
I think outcome alone and sheer outcome, the benefit of a drug to a patient alone, you see the discrepancy because we're not creating the right drugs for the right people. And to me, that's number one that shows the big inequity. But the other piece is just getting access to these trials. And you mentioned unconscious bias. And
Right.
a lot of times, and I have people who know me know I have a huge pet peeve. A lot of times you hear people talk about the reason why people of color are not on clinical trials is because of a lack of trust. That is one, yes, and there's rooted in a
Yeah.
reason. However, the data shows that if the patient is offered the trial, a lot of times people of color actually say yes. If the trial is brought to them, we get on the trials. And actually, a lot of data shows that when you brought the trials to the communities, they skyrocketed in terms of coming on clinical trials.
Right.
And there was a recent study that was presented at this Congress called ASCO this year. And
Hmm.
African American women were surveyed, the metastatic cancer, they were surveyed, and they said, how many of you were offered a clinical trial? 40% said yes. And then they said, but how many of you would have gone on a clinical trials? 80% said yes.
Mm.
So that shows you that it's not because we don't want to go on trials. We're not being offered those trials because of the unconscious bias and what lives in the minds of physicians treating these patients, thinking that automatically they won't want to go on clinical trials. So they're not even offered it. And so that to me was an eye opener to show true unconscious bias. So my pet peeve of saying it's a trust issue, that means that we're blaming the victim. And community. So, I mean, there goes, I mean, to me, unconscious bias, we can go on and on about unconscious bias being one of the big reasons why people of color are not coming on, on clinical trials.
Absolutely. I cannot agree with you more about that. And yeah, there's a lack of trust, but there's two types of trust, right? There's
Mhm.
mistrust, which is kind of based on suspicion, kind of a feeling. I don't, this person seems sketchy. And then there's distrust. And distrust is based on real actual facts, right? So there has been a real thing that's happened, not just historically, but still happening today, where there is a real distrust that being generated by the healthcare field and Black people. So, and part of that distrust is that bias that comes into play, right? You say, okay, there's a clinical trial that could have saved my life. That clinical trial, why did you offer it to me? And it's interesting. Like we started this program tonight, and the second question was, where do you find clinical trials? Right. And so there's obviously some interest. I mean, it's a small sample size, but if the second question, and we're talking a program about clinical trials, and the second question is, where do you find them? There's obviously some interest, right? And so that person I see is representative of a number of people that would get involved in clinical trials, like you said, if it was just offered up to them.
It's offered.
Yeah, just and that's so true. So what are the solutions, and specifically what are some of the things that's happening at GSK that's helping to kind of close that gap in terms of the offering, getting more Black involvement in clinical trials? Because 5% is very low when you're talking about disproportionate, in multiple myeloma, disproportionate in diabetes and hypertension and all these other illnesses, metastatic and triple negative breast cancer. We can go down a line and where we're disproportionately represented in the actual disease, but we're not represented in the clinical trials that could be on the cutting edge of new treatments for those diseases.
Yeah. So I kind of bucket them into three categories. I mean, and in terms of barriers in order to come up with solutions and what we're doing at GSK. So just inherently just trial designs. We write out clinical trials, they have eligibility criteria, they have all these different things that's usually based on white males, right? And we know that drugs metabolized or different drugs that we use are gender, age, race, ethnicity all play a part into it. So I think part of the things that we are trying to do is like, let's look at the criteria of entry. Let's look at what real baselines are across the map, right? And try to really diversify what that needs to look like. And also real world patients, making sure they're the ones that are coming on clinical trials.
Right.
So when you're looking at the integrity of a trial so that people of color are not being excluded, it's about starting there.
Right.
Um, the other piece is really coming up with a plan. understanding who has the disease, and then making sure you have a plan in place to capture that true percentage, the real world patients to come on the clinical trial. So we actually mandate now that every disease that we're working on treating, we actually put the patient demographics and who in the epidemiology, who has the disease. And then we actually are mandating that you come up with a plan to recruit that percentage of the population so they can actually come on the trial and we can understand and treat those patients. So that is a mandate that we're putting into place, and we've put into place for oncology already. But then the treaters, how do we make sure that the treaters are, like I said, are offering the trials? The treaters actually understand the patients with disease, know how to speak to them, understand what
Yes.
their individual needs are. So we are also going to start mandating that physicians who come on, who run our trials, take a course in diversity, equity, and inclusion, so they can
Yeah.
understand what to look out for.
Right.
The third piece is, a lot of times we talked about the mistrust. We spoke about even patients, real life patients are not waiting to be diagnosed with a disease. They're not sitting home saying, I'm waiting to get a disease. They are real people working, having families, doing the things that they do, living in their communities. And when they get hit hard with a disease, they have to now readjust their life. They have to leave their community, because I'll tell you, in oncology, about 80% of the patients diagnosed with the disease live in a community, 20% live in academic centers. Yet, most clinical trials are run in academic centers. So,
Right.
how do you get to and from it? So, what we've done is we're going to start upskilling physicians within the community so that we can open up more trials in their own community, meeting patients where they are. And so that's a big initiative of ours as well, going deep into the community. Um, and so those are a lot of things. And we've done other things to really even help patients get back and forth when it comes to doing clinical trials. We've simplified a lot of our clinical trials, and we've seen the data. So in 2020, the FDA even put out the news on different trials that recruited the highest amount of people of color, and for us, African Americans, for multiple myeloma. And we were number one. Um,
Wow.
and we're hitting it over and over again, where we're looking at about over 20% of our patients on our multiple myeloma program are African Americans. So there are things that we can do. There are things that we must do. And if it means that it takes longer to recruit, then make it take longer. If it means that you're holding these physicians accountable for putting those patients on, hold them accountable. But what we cannot do is accept those numbers and continue on. So we are digging in our heels. We are drawing the line, and we're making sure that we are truly recruiting patients that have the disease.
You about to make me start shouting up in here, and it's not even Sunday. I'm just, I, but this is why we're doing this program, and that's why we're going to continue to do this program, because we want people to, one, see that there's people like that, to know, and that there's people like you working on the behalf of the community, and say, okay, no, we've got to rethink how we design these clinical trials. We have to rethink how we implement these clinical trials. We have to rethink. If we look, I love the fact you said, let's look at what the typical patient is and design the trial to fit. So if 40% of African Americans have 40% of diabetes patients are African American, then we need 40% African Americans in this clinical trial to match the patient population. Like, can't have 5% people in a diabetes trial that are Black, and you got 40%. It doesn't. Oh my goodness. So there. I'm so excited. Happy to have this conversation, and just really understanding. And I want to give a shout out to GSK for doing that, for being, courageous enough. And it's not, it shouldn't take courage to do the right thing, right? But we know in today's time. But I do want to give them much, respect, and for really rethinking how the design and development implementation of these clinical trials are, because that's going to have far-reaching impact on a group of people that desperately need it. There was a couple of good questions that came in from the chat. Is that Roz is asking, is one solution that we should ask our providers for clinical trials? So she's trying to be proactive. She's saying, okay, look, I'm not going for my provider to tell me. Should I just ask them straight up?
Absolutely. 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 And here's the thing. Ask your provider if he or she is running any kind of clinical trial. And if he or she is not, then you say where. Have them point you to area or to institutions that are actually running those clinical trials, because it is in your best interest. And that's another piece. How do we even own our own health, right? And get into that driver's seat.
Right.
So absolutely, I would say always ask your provider and go through it with him or her, right? What is the best trial for you? Um,
Right.
but absolutely ask.
Yeah, that was a great question. And then we have somebody, Flora here, that is kind of representative of what you've kind of been describing. Let me see if I can get that shown. Uh, I've seen a call for clinical trials in my community, but I confess, as a Black American, I'm leery about participating because of mistrust in the integrity and fairness of the process. So Flora is representing what we're talking about. And what you're trying to overcome in your daily work is really designing trials to help people overcome that. So there's some
Yeah.
things in place in trials. And so I think we want to continue to let people know what is informed consent and how does that play out in a trial?
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you think through informed consent, number one, it's a document to let you know what to expect in a clinical trial, what it's about. Um, and I'll talk about it as an oncologist.
Right.
In oncology, a clinical trial usually has the new innovative therapy that we're testing out, and it usually compares to the standard of care. So it's not the absence of for oncology, it's not the absence of treatment, but if it is, it's basically whatever that standard of care is.
Right.
So, but whatever the informed consent is there to explain everything to you, and you should never sign unless you truly understand. And that's another thing that we're trying to revamp, simplifying informed consent, also making sure it's in different languages so that people
Right.
can understand it. But sit with your provider and do not sign anything that you do not understand. That
Mhm.
informed consent is basically said you are informed about this and you consent
Right.
to take to come in on this trial. So make sure that you completely understand it before you go on. But for the most part, it's usually the innovative therapy versus the standard of care. And so, a lot of people reference Tuskegee, which it was the absence of therapy. It was the absence of
Right.
treatment, and and just to let you know, we can never do that. Like we can never do that again. We cannot. Like it cannot happen. But
Right.
understanding the fear is real, and that's another thing. This is why I think it's important as company and as companies, you really upskill physicians in the community, because that's trust. That's who you know.
Hmm.
With the can you hear me? Or did I lose you?
You were breaking up a little bit there at the end. Yeah. Sorry.
Uh, but yeah, it's just making sure that we are bringing the trial to you into your community, because that's really who you bond with. That's where the trust is.
Right.
But more than anything, if you don't know, if you don't ask the questions, and do not leave until you're satisfied and you understand. And if you have to leave, I mean, bring your family member to help you go through it, bring them. But own it. This is a clinical trial is not an abstract thing. It is something for you to understand and digest before you even sign up for it.
Absolutely. There was a quick question that what does GSK that's stand for? So I know we were using the acronym, but what does GSK stand for?
so, um, so initially it was the big Glaxos Smith Kline
Right.
corporation, but it's basically it's a pharmaceutical company, and what we do at GSK is we develop and therapies for different diseases. I lead the oncology medical global program, and, but also for respiratory diseases, for lupus, for just different types of disease. It's medicines, and then ensure that patients get access to it. So it's both sides of the fence.
Absolutely. So yeah, GSK, yeah, that was just, but Dr. Small is really on the front lines, and we see we hear that term frontline worker all the time. We heard it a lot during the pandemic, right? Frontline worker in terms of working cashiers and wait staff and bus drivers and all that, and they are frontline workers. But Dr. Small is a frontline worker in her own right, in that she is on the front line of making sure that we have therapies and medications that are going to be inclusive of all people. And that is a front line that is not as celebrated. And so we're going to celebrate it right now, because she is there saying we need to make sure that it is indicative of the population that has this condition. We need to find a new way of designing it instead of forcing people to drive across their city. Why can't we put a satellite research center in their neighborhood and have the doctors go there? They have the means, make the doctor go there and reach out to the community. Why can't we have people have? I've heard about programs having daycare services and
Yes.
providing public transportation for them, opening up on Saturdays and not just being available. So when people, are off work, so they're really doing innovative things in order to recruit and attract more people of color to these trials. So well, our role and responsibility as the trial participants is we've got to enroll, right? We've got to, have a healthy, understanding and distrust is still there. And recognize it's still there, but we also have to realize, and that's the kind of the theme of this whole program is involvement improves outcomes, and we cannot improve our outcomes if we do not get involved. And so ultimately, that's what we're here for. It's just the fastest 30 minutes. I may have extended the show to an hour, but it's the fastest 30 minutes. Any final things that you would like for our audience to know about what GSK is doing, what you're doing out there, or just what they should know about clinical trials to maybe have those conversations with their primary care physician to start that process of getting on clinical trials if they need them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you one more thing. I mean, one of the things that led me into come into drug development, I think people don't understand, every drug you take, every therapy you take is based on someone who creates it, right? And the organization that creates it. I left academia because I was losing patients. I did not have the tools I needed to save a lot of my patients. And so we came into, and actually I lost a lot of people of color. And
Mm.
and so coming to drug development to create the right medicines for them. But we can't do, pharma can't do it alone. People and me, I can't do, like, we have to get together. We have to say, this is, you need to speak up and say, this is what I need in my community. This is what I need. We will listen, but we have to hold hands and make sure that people of color are getting the right access. People of color are getting of medicines and getting the right access to research, and so that we can truly develop the right medicines for you. So if you are diagnosed with anything, go to your physician, ask them, is there any, what is the best medicine for me? Are there any trials available for me? And do not walk out of that office until you are satisfied with that answer, because this is your health and you own it. But again, we got to do this together. So thank you for the time.
No, this is fantastic. And those, there was a question earlier about where they can go. Black Doctor, we have a clinical trials resource center on our webpage. And so it's scrolling across the bottom. I also dropped it in the comments that you can click on directly. And if you want to go to blackdoctor.org, there's a tab that says resource centers. Just click on that and go down to the clinical trials. And it has articles and information about ongoing trials. And we're putting trials that are ongoing on that resource center. It's growing every day, much like we did during COVID. We kept it up to date, and we kept people up to date on the latest and how COVID was impacting Black folks. We're doing the same thing with clinical trials. We're going to be talking about those trials that are important to Black people, how you can get involved, and we're going to hold them accountable. Just like Dr. Small is saying, we're going to hold people accountable. If somebody says that they went to a trial that we recommended and they weren't treated properly, we're going to hold them accountable, because that's what we're here to do. Because we cannot get better medications, we cannot get better treatments without us being involved. And so we've got to do it in a very meaningful and important way.
And thank you for this program. I mean, this is fantastic. It's so needed. It's so needed. So
Thank
thank
you
you for
so
doing what
much.
you do.
first Thursday of every month. So we're going to be here, and we're probably going to have to up it because there's so much information out there, and we want to get so many more people involved. But start with your primary care physician. Ask them if they don't suggest. If you are diagnosed with something and you want to know, because guess what happens? When you get involved in clinical trials, sometimes you get the best medications, you get the newest medications, and if and it's for free, right? It's at no
Yes,
cost.
it is for free. It is.
Yes. Please get involved. He's like, wow. He's like, hey, you get the best medications, you get ongoing treatment. They're going to make sure that there's no adverse effects. So they're always monitoring what's going on with you. And it's all at no charge. And so you get the cutting edge treatment on your condition at no charge. It's a win-win for you. So really, there's no reason. So Roz, thank you for that comment. Thank you, Dr. Small at blackdoctor.org. Make sure you go to our resource center. Dr. Small, we'd love to have you back again here. You've been such a joy to work with and at GSK, and because multiple myeloma, we've done multiple programs on multiple myeloma. Love to have you on talking about that. Anything in oncology, I'm calling you first because you are the person that we love to have you. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. This has been fantastic, and we'll see you. We're going to be December 1st is a Thursday, so we're going to push it to December 8th, and we've got the Chief of Diversity coming from Cedars-Sinai Hospital, and the Chief of Research coming on, both Black women. So I just want to let y'all know, both Black women at one of the largest, most well-known hospitals here in the United States. And we're going to talk about what they're doing there at Cedars-Sinai to get more Black people involved in research and diversity of their research projects at Cedars-Sinai. So really big things coming up. We got some wonderful things coming up in 2023 as well. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Clinical Trials and Black Folks.
Thank you.